the police started thinking, well, maybe this is just a cover-up, that the Ramseys harmed their child some way, then panicked and tried to create basically a kidnapping scenario.
Patsy and John should have been taken to the police station immediately for separate interviews, for examination of their body for defensive wounds, for collection of their clothing. That never happened.
A ransom note was discovered at the scene. It was a case that would deeply divide public opinion across America. Yet while the headlines focused intensely on the Ramsey family, JonBenét Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, their son Burke Ramsey, and the tragic fate of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. Another name was briefly mentioned, only to be largely forgotten. Chris Wolfe. A journalist and the boyfriend of a local woman, he returned home that night exhibiting behavior that was starkly out of character. His girlfriend, Jackie Dilson, became convinced he could have been involved. What precisely did she observe in his conduct that instilled such a profound sense of fear? Was it a specific statement he made, an action he could not account for, or was it a visceral instinct that something was fundamentally amiss? And why was this lead, seemingly supported by a compelling personal testimony, so quickly dismissed by investigators? Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. Jackie Dilson, sometimes referred to as Jackie Wilson, was not a detective or a journalist. She led an unassuming life in Boulder, Colorado, working as a part-time office manager for a small, not-for-profit organization. She had no discernible reason to involve herself in one of the nation's most sensational criminal cases. However, it is often those closest to a situation who perceive details that others miss. Jackie was an individual who paid meticulous attention to nuance, not merely what someone wore, but the subtle shifts in their posture, the duration of a pause before answering a question, and crucially, the things left unsaid. In 1996, she was living with Chris Wolfe. Their relationship was not without its difficulties, marked by arguments and emotional distance, but nothing could have prepared her for the events of that Christmas night. And she recalled it with striking clarity. The disquieting silence preceding his arrival, the smell of sweat and soil clinging to him, and the hurried, almost frantic way he moved about their flat. Jackie observed that he appeared like someone desperately attempting to reverse an irrevocable act. He refused to disclose his whereabouts and was covered in dirt and what looked like fragments of leaves. He immediately stripped off his clothes, washed them, and concealed his boots deep inside a wardrobe. He then began to rant loudly and bitterly about the Ramseys, expressing contempt for what he perceived as their insincerity. Jackie did not react with accusations. Instead, she methodically documented the events. She retrieved her journal and recorded everything. The time he arrived home, his appearance, his exact words, and the unsettled, darting motion of his eyes. While she was not yet certain what she had witnessed, she knew instinctively that it was deeply wrong. In the days that followed, her unease grew into a focused investigation. She compared timelines, followed the news coverage, and matched his behaviors to the developing case. Ultimately, she compiled a formal timeline of Chris Wolfe's actions before and after the incident. She then took a step few in her position would have dared. She contacted the police, turned over her notes, and even reached out directly to JonBenét Ramsey. The response, however, was a resounding silence. No one followed up. No detective ever visited her home. Her account was never cross-examined, challenged, or even formally questioned. It was as if she were shouting into a dense fog. Despite her persistence, contacting solicitors, media producers, and victim advocacy groups, her testimony failed to gain traction. It lacked the hard evidence the case seemed to demand. There was no forensic link, no incriminating footage, no definitive proof. In a case saturated with media noise and dramatic imagery, Jackie's quiet, coherent testimony was easily overlooked. Her story was not disproven. It was simply buried. Chris Wolf was, in many respects, a man who existed on the periphery of the world around him. During the 1990s in Boulder, Colorado, he was a fringe presence, moving through life with a charged intensity. As a freelance journalist without a permanent newsroom, he chose independence over stability, a choice that brought financial uncertainty and professional isolation. He was not integrated into the town's social fabric. Acquaintances described him in terms that stopped short of comfort: strange but harmless, or odd but not threatening. His most consistent human connection was Jackie Dilson. Wolf's worldview was shaped by a profound contempt for social facades and the powerful figures he believed controlled public narratives. His writing, often found in niche publications, pulsed with disdain for the elite, government institutions, and a media he saw as a conduit for falsehoods. His articles were biting and visceral, dissecting America's obsession with wealth and celebrity. Beneath the prose, however, was an undercurrent of anger that felt more personal than political. He seemed to be wrestling with hypocrisy, not from a distance, but from a place of deep emotional unrest. Jackie, who knew him best, witnessed a darker side. She recalled moments when he would lose himself in spirals of fury, his voice rising and his hands shaking as he ranted about societal manipulation, particularly concerning children and violence in the media. His tirades were not theoretical. They were raw and personal, causing Jackie to quietly question what he was truly capable of. Yet, to the wider public, Chris Wolf was a non-entity when the JonBenét case first broke. His emergence came later, as a tangential figure mentioned in lawsuits when JonBenét and Patsy Ramsey named him as a potential suspect in their book, The Death of Innocence. Wolf sued for defamation and lost, but the event created only a minor ripple. In the grand narrative of JonBenét's death, Chris Wolf occupied a liminal space, never formally accused, yet never fully exonerated. One might ask why Chris Wolf faded from the narrative, while other figures remained fixed under the media spotlight. A significant part of the answer lies in the clinical nature of evidence. There was no physical link, no blood, fingerprints, or DNA, tying him to the crime scene. In a case where the public and press demanded certainty, his connection remained speculative, more smoke than fire. The Boulder police never designated him a formal suspect, and without an official target on his back, the media's attention shifted elsewhere. Furthermore, his public image did not fit the established theatricality of the tragedy. He was not a grieving father before the cameras or a pageant mother in a sparkling jacket. Wolf was a quiet, intense figure whose persona did not generate headlines. He was, in the eyes of the press, background noise, rather than a central character. Yet, what remains profoundly disturbing is the institutional silence that surrounded him. A woman who lived with him, who knew his moods and his temper, approached the authorities with detailed notes and a credible fear that something was terribly wrong, and seemingly nothing was done. This raises a critical question. Was Chris Wolf simply forgotten, or was the system unwilling to look? After the defamation suit was dismissed, Wolf's silence deepened. He gave no interviews and made no public efforts to clear his name. For a man who had once raged against media manipulation, this complete withdrawal was jarring. It prompts an uncomfortable consideration. Did Chris Wolf fade into obscurity by chance, or did he ensure it would happen? Jackie Dilson never claimed to be a criminal profiler, but her interpretation of Chris Wolf's behavior on the night of JonBenét Ramsey's death was unwavering. Her theory was not built on forensic science, but on years of observing a man she believed was unraveling internally. She posited that Wolfe harbored a deep resentment towards the wealth and status the Ramseys embodied. She saw his mockery of them escalate from mere opinion to a dangerous obsession. Control was another central theme. Jackie noted that when Wolfe felt powerless, he would lash out. She considered the possibility that if he ever felt a complete loss of control, he might commit an unthinkable act simply to reclaim a sense of power. Jackie did not believe the act was premeditated. Rather, she theorized that Wolfe may have encountered JonBenét in a moment of opportunity. Perhaps a confrontation, intended only to disrupt their perfect world, escalated tragically. The subsequent cover-up, the ransom note, the duct tape, the garrote, struck her not as the work of a calculated perpetrator, but as theatrical and symbolic acts born of panic and shame. She wondered if he had sought to destroy the symbol of the child pageant queen, not out of hatred for the child herself, but for what she represented. Jackie also considered other possibilities. Perhaps Wolfe did not commit the act himself, but knew who did, or perhaps he assisted in the cover-up. His actions that night, washing his clothes, hiding his boots, were indicative of fear. And fear can stem not only from guilt, but also from knowledge. In the days that followed, Chris became fixated on the case, watching the news for hours, ranting and speculating. Yet Jackie noticed a peculiar omission. He never once asked the question on everyone else's lips. Who could have done this? It was as if, to him, the answer was already known. One night, as they watched coverage of the funeral, Chris Wolfe muttered under his breath, "No, they'll get what they deserve." Jackie Dilson did not fully comprehend what that meant, but she never forgot the words. She acknowledged the possibility that Chris was simply an unusual individual, that his behaviors, his paranoia, and his mood swings might have had no connection to the tragic event. Perhaps she was seeking patterns that did not exist. However, when a man returns home covered in dirt, refuses to speak, immediately washes his clothes, hides his boots, and begins ranting about the victim's family on the very night a 6-year-old girl has been found deceased in their town, it ceases to feel like a coincidence and starts to feel like a danger. It is one thing to recall details, but it is another to document them, organize them, and submit them to law enforcement. Jackie Dilson did not just tell a story, she constructed a case. What she provided was not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was a compelling pattern of behavior, context, and a sense of urgency. Crucially, her warnings came early, before widespread media theories took hold, and before public pressure mounted. Yet, the system did not respond. Her timeline was not vague. It was recorded hour by hour, noting when Chris left, when he returned, what he wore, how he moved, and what he said. These were not faded memories collected years later. They were recorded as they happened. The strength of this timeline lies in its consistency, showing a routine turned abnormal. A man out late, refusing to speak, and going to great lengths to erase his tracks demands an explanation. Jackie also described the boots Chris wore in detail, believing they matched the description of unidentified boot prints found at the scene. While not definitive proof, it is a significant point of interest, especially when paired with his immediate need to wash his clothes upon returning home. Furthermore, Chris Wolfe's language regarding the Ramseys was not that of a concerned citizen reacting to a tragedy. It was obsessive. Jackie's notes preserve specific phrases like, "they had it coming," and describe the situation as fake as hell. Such statements are not neutral. They are loaded, deeply personal, and suggest an emotional investment rather than detached observation. Jackie presented her report to the Boulder Police Department and wrote to JonBenét Ramsey, but received no response. This represents a failure not just of forensics, but of listening. To this day, it remains unclear if Chris Wolf's DNA was ever collected and tested, a haunting omission in an investigation stalled by a lack of physical evidence. The refusal to even test a person of interest, named by his live-in partner, within days of the incident, defies logical investigative procedure. Jackie had a series of small, consistent and timely observations that, when taken together, showed a man attempting to conceal his actions and a system that appeared unwilling to investigate an inconvenient truth. Jackie Dilson was not a woman who made accusations lightly. Described by others as measured and observant, she noticed everything. Chris Wolf, on the other hand, presented a complex persona. From a distance, he could appear intelligent and principled, but up close, those same traits could manifest as paranoia and aggressive rants. The night of December 25th, 1996, became a psychological turning point for Jackie. When Chris walked through the door, clothes filthy, boots hidden, eyes evasive, she saw someone who had crossed a line. Her response was not to confront him, but to document. This speaks to a learned behavior of passive vigilance, often adopted by those who feel powerless but perceive danger. She did not panic. She prepared, using the act of writing to maintain her sanity in a reality that had suddenly become unstable. Chris, conversely, exhibited traits associated with high-functioning narcissism and latent aggression. His disdain for the Ramseys was described by Jackie as personal disgust, a dehumanizing emotion that suggests he saw them as beneath him. His rants against the media and suburban wealth were not social commentary, but projection. He despised them because they represented a world that he felt had rejected him and noticed them, while he remained unseen. For him, JonBenét Ramsey, though just a child, may have symbolized a manufactured perfection, pageants, cameras, attention, that acted as a trigger for his resentment. When a person begins to see symbols instead of people, they can rationalize any act. His behavior after the event did not resemble grief or curiosity, but rather containment. He did not ask who could have done this. He stated they had it coming. Jackie's trauma was compounded when she realized no one would listen, a phenomenon trauma experts call institutional betrayal. Chris, meanwhile, filed a defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys after their book named him, a move Jackie saw as a performance to reframe himself as the victim. What makes Chris Wolf a figure of concern in Jackie's eyes is not a confession, but the lasting sense of fear he instilled. It's easy to assume justice is a straight line, but the chain broke in this case. Jackie documented the disturbing comments, the night he came home, muddy and shaken, the boots he hid, and the venom with which he spoke of the Ramsey family. She brought it all to the Boulder Police Department, and they did nothing. To this day, no one has confirmed if his DNA was ever tested. The silence from the authorities suggested to her they were not going to look, perhaps because they had already decided on their suspects. This theory is echoed by JonBenét Ramsey, who stated, "They decided it was me on day one." Investigators appeared to zero in on the family from the beginning, despite the fact that unknown DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing, which did not match any family member. They seemed to dismiss outside leads and alternative persons of interest, including the information provided by Jackie. Years later, as new documentaries revisited the case, Chris Wolf's name was conspicuously absent, making him invisible to a new generation of observers. After his failed defamation lawsuit, he had become a radioactive topic. Yet in online forums and comment sections, people began to ask questions. Who is Chris Wolf? Why wasn't he interviewed on camera? Why was the information she provided not followed up? The Boulder Police Department offered no answers, only stating that the investigation remained ongoing. For Jackie, that promise came decades too late, after she had already endured the silence. The public was only now beginning to realize what had been lost. Not just time and leads, but the very integrity of the investigative process itself. They began to understand that justice isn't just about identifying a perpetrator. It's about listening to those brave enough to say, "I think something's wrong." And Jackie Dilson had done that repeatedly, only to be met with silence by a system seemingly more interested in self-preservation than in correcting its course. The most painful part for her is the lingering uncertainty. She doesn't know if Chris Wolf has ever been officially cleared. There is no public record she has seen that confirms he was ever fully investigated or exonerated. For all she knows, the man she believes returned home after a child's tragic death has never had to account for his whereabouts that night. The boots he hid, the laundry he washed, or the words he spoke when he thought no one was listening. Perhaps that is the greater tragedy of the JonBenét Ramsey case. Not just the life that was lost, but the truths that were ignored. People like Jackie stood up and said, "Look here," only to have the world turn its head the other way. We like to believe that mistakes in major investigations are rare, that incompetence is the exception. But what if the most important clue was handed to police on paper, only to be filed away as a nuisance? What if the case was solvable, and the chance was missed because someone decided that Jackie Dilson didn't fit their idea of a credible witness? For over 2 decades, Chris Wolf's name barely surfaced in public conversations about the JonBenét Ramsey case. While documentaries re-examined theories about intruders and family secrets, his name slipped through the cracks. Then, the internet changed the dynamic, and silence had nowhere to hide. It began in the corners of the web, a Reddit thread here, a YouTube comment there. Mentions of a man who dated a woman named Jackie, a man who returned home late on the night of the incident, a man not featured in the mainstream documentaries. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the question emerged. Who is Chris Wolf, and why hasn't he been discussed? In comment sections beneath videos with millions of views, strangers began to piece together fragments of information. A user shared that Wolf had filed a defamation lawsuit against the Ramseys. Another posted quotes from court documents. Someone else detailed how Jackie had submitted meticulous records to the Boulder police and never heard back. And one logical, non-conspiratorial question echoed. Why hasn't his DNA been tested? In an age of digital trails and forensic podcasts, the idea that a key person of interest might have been overlooked was infuriating to many. Supporters of Jackie flooded online forums with summaries of her account, citing her notes, the timeline, the boots, the laundry, and the things Chris had allegedly said. They repeated JonBenét Ramsey's own words from a 2024 interview, where he described Jackie as very solid and consistent. Though no one could prove guilt, what emerged was an undeniable fact. Chris Wolf had not been publicly or officially ruled out. That was enough to reopen the door, at least online. But with this renewed interest came resistance. For every supporter urging authorities to simply test his DNA, there were skeptics pushing back, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that you cannot ruin a person's life based on an ex-girlfriend's gut feeling. This created a cultural rift between those who insisted we must believe women who come forward and those who argued that belief is not evidence and the presumption of innocence must be protected. In the middle of it all remained a cold case and a child who never received justice. JonBenét Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey also suspected that Chris Wolf was involved in their daughter's death, a theory they put forward in their memoir, The Death of Innocence, first published in March 2000. In this deeply personal narrative, the Ramseys vehemently deny any involvement in the death of their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, who was found in the basement of their Boulder, Colorado home on Christmas morning, 1996. They portray themselves as victims of a flawed police investigation and relentless media scrutiny, criticizing the Boulder Police Department for fixating on the family while ignoring other potential suspects. The book explores their emotional ordeal and reliance on faith, dedicating a significant portion to countering what they describe as media misinformation. They take aim at the sensationalized portrayal of their wealth and JonBenét's pageant lifestyle, attempting to reclaim their daughter's image while shifting suspicion towards an intruder. They cited unconfirmed DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing, which did not match any family member, a claim later used by the Boulder District Attorney in 2008 to issue a controversial public apology and a declaration of the Ramseys' innocence. However, the book received mixed reviews. Supporters praised it for offering a raw perspective from grieving parents, while critics accused the Ramseys of using the memoir to manipulate public perception. Some pointed out that the book's emotional tone and rhetorical style oddly mirrored the infamous ransom note found at the scene, fueling further suspicion. Despite the controversy, the death of innocence remains one of the most significant personal accounts related to the case, serving as both a defense of the family's innocence and a case study in how media, public opinion, and flawed investigations can complicate the pursuit of justice. In 2000, Chris Wolf filed a defamation lawsuit against JonBenét Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey for naming him as a person of interest in their book. It was the first time Wolf's name had entered the public sphere in connection with the case. Rather than use the opportunity to tell his side of the story, he allowed the court process to speak for him. When the case was dismissed in 2003, he made no appeals and no public statements. The court's ruling did not find Wolf guilty, nor did it clear him. It simply determined that the Ramseys had a constitutional right to express their suspicions. This nuanced outcome vindicated no one and left a significant gap in the narrative. Consequently, Chris Wolf became a lingering presence in the margins of the case, not charged, not cleared, just there. In the years that followed, as the true crime genre exploded, his name was almost never mentioned. He wasn't interviewed, quoted, or even listed among fringe persons of interest. Some argue this is because there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene. But others question why the detailed, specific, and consistent testimony of his then-girlfriend Jackie Dilson was not more aggressively pursued. Why wasn't Wolf definitively eliminated as a possibility? To this day, it is not publicly known if his DNA was ever collected or what was done with Jackie's meticulous timeline and notes. All that is known is that a man returned home on the night of the incident, exhibiting behavior that terrified the person closest to him, and that story was effectively buried. For years, Jackie Dilson's voice went unheard. But in 2024, nearly 3 decades after the death of JonBenét Ramsey, she decided to speak for herself, publicly and permanently. She began writing, transforming her collection of notes and timelines into a manuscript titled The Boots in the Closet. The book is not a new story, but the same one she has been telling for years, now bound and published. It details everything. The night Chris Wolf came home, shaking and silent, the clothes he immediately washed, the boots he hid, his strange rants about the Ramsey family, and the documents she handed to the Boulder Police Department, including the questions they never asked and the DNA they never requested. This time, people are reading. Within weeks of the book's announcement, the true crime community took notice. Podcasts requested interviews, and news outlets began revisiting Chris Wolf's name, not as a dismissed rumor, but as a legitimate lead buried under decades of silence. The book includes photocopies of her original dated notes and transcripts of what she submitted to police, providing a tangible record of her efforts. In a significant development, the Boulder Police Department, after years of silence, took a meeting with JonBenét Ramsey. According to Ramsey, the cold case unit was professional, focused, and for the first time, hopeful. In a brief public statement, he confirmed they were looking back at everything, every file, every name, every possibility, including people the public hasn't heard about. He did not say Chris Wolf's name, but the timing was telling. This renewed attention is different. It's not just Jackie's voice anymore. It's the readers posting excerpts from her book, podcasters creating multi-episode series, and people tweeting directly at the police demanding updates. It's also JonBenét Ramsey, who still insists on one more test, because the DNA profile of an unknown male found on JonBenét's clothing remains unidentified. Chris Wolf is still alive, a fact that startles many. He has never been arrested, charged, or even officially named by the Boulder Police Department as a person of interest. He lingers just outside the frame of the main narrative. Jackie Dilson still does not know if police ever tested Chris Wolf's DNA. JonBenét Ramsey doesn't know either. In a recent interview, he stated bluntly, "That's a good question. I don't know if they ever did." How a case that captivated a nation could proceed with such a glaring omission is a question that now haunts everyone who has followed it seriously. The most concrete forensic clue in the entire JonBenét Ramsey investigation is an unknown male DNA profile found on her clothing and under her fingernails. That profile does not match her father, her mother, or her brother. Modern forensic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, has the potential to trace this profile. All that is needed is one match: a distant cousin, a family tree, a name. If Chris Wolf is innocent, this could finally clear him. And if he is not, then perhaps justice, long overdue, can still be found. The unknown male DNA profile found at the scene does not match the officers who responded, nor does it match known friends, family members, or prior household visitors. It matches no one in the National Criminal Database. That partial profile is still there, still waiting. And for reasons that remain unclear, no one can publicly confirm whether Chris Wolf has ever been tested against it. That kind of silence feels heavy, not just for Jackie Dilson or the Ramsey family, but for everyone who has tried to make sense of what happened in that house on Christmas night. This case isn't just unsolved, it's suspended in a state of limbo where a person of interest can float uninvestigated for decades. However, there is a sliver of hope. The Boulder Police Department has reopened the investigation under a cold case unit, reportedly bringing in outside consultants and fresh eyes. According to JonBenét Ramsey, they have committed to reviewing every file and every lead. This, combined with advances in forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer, offers a new path forward. Experts believe the small but viable DNA profile from the scene could lead investigators to a relative, a family tree, and a name. All it requires is permission, funding, and the courage to face what new tests might reveal: mistakes, missed opportunities, and people who should have been questioned and weren't. This raises critical questions. Why was Chris Wolf not tested? Why did Jackie's detailed testimony fall through the cracks? Why, after almost 30 years, is it still unclear whether one of the earliest civilian witnesses was ever taken seriously? The silence from the authorities continues, with the occasional reminder that the case remains an ongoing investigation. What if the truth was never really gone? What if it was always there, sitting quietly in a stack of ignored files and statements that no one wanted to read? Chris Wolf's name was there from the beginning, spoken quietly by one woman, Jackie Dilson. She didn't make demands, she just told her story. The man she lived with came home late on the night JonBenét Ramsey was found. He was sweating and silent. His clothes were dirty, and he went straight to the washing machine. She found boots hidden away that she believed matched marks found at the Ramsey home. She wrote it all down, his words, his behavior, his assertion that the Ramseys were lying before anyone had even used the word suspect. She submitted it all to the police, but nothing happened. No questions, no follow-up, no test. Jackie waited while the media turned the Ramsey family inside out, while documentaries speculated on every other theory, and through it all, Chris Wolf remained untouched, uninvestigated, and ignored. Eventually, she wrote a book, not to accuse, but to document and demand clarity. Slowly, people started paying attention, raising a question that should have been asked 30 years ago. What if we just tested his DNA? That single act could finally close one door or open another. We've been afraid to look behind. Chris Wolf might be innocent, but we don't know, because no one ever officially confirmed it. The most powerful piece of evidence in this case isn't speculation. It's DNA. It has never been matched to Chris Wolf, because as far as the public knows, his sample was never collected. That is not due process. It is silence, dressed up as caution. Justice delayed, especially for a child, is justice denied. The irony is profound. We live in an age where forensic genealogy can solve cases that went cold before the internet existed. Yet in this case, we still haven't tested every credible lead. Why? Is it institutional pride? Fear of admitting past errors, or something else? Chris Wolf has never had to answer the most vital question in such an investigation. Where were you? Until that changes, a shadow will remain over Jackie Dilson, the Ramsey family, and the city of Boulder. Justice isn't found in theories or delivered by documentaries. It's earned through action. It requires the courage to confront the stories we find uncomfortable. JonBenét Ramsey deserves better than shadows. She deserves the truth. And that truth begins with a name we must finally face. Chris Wolf may be innocent, but justice cannot assume. It must confirm. That starts with a swab, a match, a moment of honesty that is 30 years late, but not too late. JonBenét was only 6 years old. She never had a chance to speak for herself. Perhaps we still can, not by chasing sensational theories, but by confronting the silences we allowed to settle. One DNA swab, one act of transparency, one question asked out loud without fear. That's what it could take to shift everything. The files are still there. The name is still there. The questions are still unanswered. But so is the hope that someone will finally say, enough. Not for the headlines, but for her. Because every child deserves the truth. And as long as a single shadow remains, one name, untested and unexplained, the case isn't closed. It's only paused. As the dust settles on decades of speculation and silence, and with new paths to answers finally emerging, how does this story leave you feeling? Does the persistence of one woman's voice against a backdrop of institutional inertia give you hope, or does the passage of so much time fill you with frustration? When you consider the possibility that a simple test could unlock a 30-year-old mystery, what actions do you believe should be taken now, not just by the authorities, but by a public that continues to seek justice for JonBenét?